Hi, Misha here, and we kind of started off with the infantry tank Mark IV, the Churchill, and then delved into cruisers and got all the way through the modern era with Challengers, and then wrapped back around to the first and second infantry tanks, Mark I, Mark II, Matilda, Junior and Senior. But between 2 and 4, there was a missing tank. The tank infantry Mark III Valentine. And finally have one to show you here. Some say these Eagle Moss or Fabry models aren't the best, and that's true, but they're a nice little representation of tanks that other larger manufacturers just don't seem interested in doing in 1/72 scale diecast. They do have metal bodies, rubber tracks, and moving turrets, and sometimes even moving guns, like this Mark II here. This one doesn't. And this is a bit of a different tank from Vickers. Whereas the early cruisers were the A9 and A10, and the original Matildas were the A11 and A12, the Valentine doesn't have an A designation from the government, from the War Office, because it started off as something totally private, in-house, developed at Vickers. And I'm not sure how much involvement with this tank he directly had, but John Carden had worked pretty much on the Matildas. And in a lot of ways, the Vickers is a Matilda streamlined for mass production and trying to combine some of the attributes of a cruiser and an infantry tank. It was also very popular with the Soviet Russians. Although they'd never admit it, they really didn't like admitting they liked any kind of British hardware. So, with that, let's talk about it. So why the name Valentine? Well, no one really knows for sure. There are several apocryphal and theoretical and conjectural reasons why. So throughout the video, I'll mention them. And first, the most romantic, shall we say, it said that the design was presented to the War Office on St. Valentine's Day, February 14. This doesn't seem to be 100% true because some argue over the year. Some say 1938, but the truth is the design was first shown off on February 10, 1938. Others say, no, they mean the first actual production model from 1940. May or may not be true. Who knows? But it's kind of entered into the lore, the legend now. And this really was meant to be an evolution of the Matilda. They used a lot of off-the-shelf components from the previous cruisers and infantry tanks so they could get it into production quite quickly. And it didn't have a whole lot of new going on, just refining everything for mass production, something that really they would end up needing. Like I said, this started off as a project within Vickers, and at first the War Office, the Ministry was not interested terribly much. The main drawback to them was that it had a 2-man turret. And the reason Vickers went with this turret, they wanted to make this as light and low profile as possible. Now the low profile they succeeded. It's under 7.5 feet tall. Not bad for a tank. For what it's worth, it's not especially light. It's about 16 tons. So, I mean, by modern standards, quite light, but by the standards of the day. But they used the savings in other areas to provide pretty thick armor. It had 60 millimeters in the front. Originally had 60 millimeters on the sides, and even a few spots in the rear had 60 millimeters. Others 50 and others 20. But well, war. So they finally decided to go ahead and accept this in April of 1939, placing the first order for tanks that summer, with the understanding that Vickers could have these delivered by May of 1940, so in under a year. And as it turns out, they were on, and it was actually a good thing. The British military lost a lot of tanks that May and June, primarily at Dunkirk and other places, and they were in desperate need of whatever they could get. And by September of that year, Vickers had already turned out over 100, and this would quickly ramp up. Vickers would turn out over 2,500. And wouldn't just stop there. Other manufacturers would make these in England. Over 6,800 in total there. Plus, in 1941, manufacturing would start off in Canada. And they would build over 1,400 there. Meaning the total was around 8,300 all told. Plus it spawned several specialized vehicles like the Archer. But it didn't really go through prototyping. They did, of course, put it through trials, but they didn't really order a prototype. There were a couple of pilot models unofficially, but officially they just ordered it straight into production. And that's because the Matilda over here, well, it was a peacetime tank. The hull was pretty complicated. This didn't really offer much more armor, and wasn't especially fast, only about 15 miles per hour, although compared to some earlier tanks, that's lightning. But it did standardize on a lot of things, and it was known for reliability and dependability, and being able to go a long distance without major servicing. And those were pretty revolutionary things for a British tank in the early war years. Here we have the Matilda, the Tank Infantry Mark II, and the Tank Infantry Mark III. By the way, the name Valentine was not officially applied and used until June of 1941, but of course it had kind of stuck around with the tank since its inception. Another possible reason is that it happens to be the middle name, Valentine, of John Carden, the pretty much prime chief tank designer at Vickers. Although this could just be a coincidence. No one really knows. So this started to be produced in the summer of 1940, allowing Matilda 1s to be fully retired out. And in the beginning they were used more like cruiser tanks, because the cruiser Mark 1s and Mark 2s weren't fantastic, and even the cruiser Mark III had some serious limitations. So they kind of more used as cruisers than infantry. They were relatively nimble and low profile and decent handling, if not a great top speed. They had a crew of 3, driver towards the front. In the middle we had a 2-man turret. That meant that there was a gunner, and then a commander who had to do double duty as loader. Luckily, the QF 2-pounder gun, kind of the standard Brit gun at the time, the shells weren't that heavy. So it's alright. They were good anti-tank rounds for 1940, 1941, but even then they were known to be pretty wimpy when it came to high explosive, so they weren't terribly useful against infantry. Now, it did have a 7.9mm Beza machine gun coaxially mounted with about 3,100 rounds, so at least it had that. Pretty bare bones. And the Mark I started off with a gasoline, or petrol, as the Brits call it, engine. And, yeah, it started to really make a name for itself in North Africa, operating in various theaters there. And started to really get there in spring, early summer of 1941. And its first major operation was Operation Crusader later on that year. And it continued to serve well throughout the battles of El Alamein and into Tunisia between late 1942 and into 1943. It proved to be quite dependable, and it worked quite well in the harsh environment of the desert. Of course, it has to be said that for the crew, it was a pretty cramped tank. The driver did have quite good visibility, but yeah, he didn't have a lot of elbow room. But that was really nothing compared to the two guys in the very small turret. The early version, Mark 1s and so on, were welded. They were riveted. They did use some rolled steel plate combined with some casting, kind of a hybrid design, especially for the turret. And they always did have a radio. Again, like most Brit tanks, it was located in the turret itself. So the commander had a lot to do. He was pretty well pressed upon. On the other hand, they were able to crank these out quite a bit because the bottom part was pretty much like the Vickers cruiser, and a lot of other components like the gun were pretty well standard. Again, nothing outstanding about this tank, but it really did a good job. It was probably the best infantry tank they had until the Mark IV Churchill came around. Even then, kind of debatable. It was had quite good armor protection. It could definitely stand up to the early war German anti-tank guns and high explosives. Of course, later on, as they upgunned their tanks, it would be less effective. Its main detraction was the relatively low top speed and the inherent limitations of the QF 2-pounder gun. But several factories would make these in the UK, and again, they would be producing in Canada at this time, and they would start to kind of export these around to their allies. It should be noted that they were deployed in Italy, Sicily, and what have you. But by D-Day and after, they weren't in terribly heavy use in Europe itself, northwestern Europe. A few kicked about. They would operate alongside the Archer because they were very similar and shared components. And some were kept for command vehicles. Some were re-gunned with close support cannon or howitzers, if you will. And many more were kept in the British home islands. However, even though they were pretty much decidedly obsolete by 1944, production would continue throughout that year, with final deliveries actually in 1945. And the reason, well, that's because they were very popular with the Russians, at least compared to other British tanks. So here we are, next to the Churchill. Another possible reason for the name Valentine was not exactly an acronym, but a combination of words that stood for Vickers Armstrong Limited's factory at Trent. This was kind of a British thing. They did it, for example, the Brin. The BR was for Bruno, and Czechoslovakia, the EN was for Enfield, or the Sten, the S and T were for the designers, with the EN for Enfield. Again, this is more or less supposition. It does fit, but there's no real confirmation of it. Still, it's a possibility. But the Soviets seemed to be taken with the tank, at least compared to what else was on offer, and they started to receive these quite early on in 1941, and they were immediately rushed from the ports to help defend Moscow, what would later be known as the Battle of Moscow, and would be kept in frontline service for a while. And then by 1943, as more and more T-34s became available, kind of relegated to second line service, or service in less active theaters, say in the north, in the Arctic regions, or in east. But the thing is, the soldiers like them for their relatively good armor, their dependability, their durability. They liked the engine. But they did complain about the relatively light gun, and they did complain about the relatively low top speed. And early on, they did have some problems with the tracks freezing up or getting stuck in mud or snow, but solutions were found either in the field or otherwise, so more of an early teething thing. The reason I say they must have liked them, the Soviet High Command requested not only that deliveries continue, but that manufacturing of the Valentine continue. In fact, of the over 1,400 built in Canada, pretty much all of them were sent to the Soviet Union. And quite a few, well over 2,000 British production. In fact, about 2,100 British Valentines and about 1,200 Canadian Valentines made it to Russia. Another 400-ish were lost en route because the Germans. That really meant they were a very major user of the tank. They did play around with upgunning it, putting something a little more powerful in it. But in the end, not much came of this. So Britain did continue manufacturing past really its need for its Russian allies. And that really goes to show you just how relatively easy, straightforward, and simple the manufacturing of the Valentine was, which very good things. In fact, in 1945, as Russia was gearing up to fight the Japanese, that July and August of invading Manchuria, as it were, they would still have about 40 Valentine tanks in the group, as well as some older tanks, but also some of the newer T-34-85 tanks. So they were deploying them right up to the end of their activities. Another noteworthy user in the Pacific was New Zealand. They would receive over 200 Valentine tanks, and they would actively deploy fighting the Japanese, a few dozen. And they would also change the guns on about 9 or 10 of theirs to the QF 3-pounder howitzer, the 76 millimeter, to use it as a close support tank. Australia would have a few as well. But yeah, Russia was certainly the biggest user. Interestingly, Canada did not ever deploy the Valentine for active service. The handful they retained for themselves were just training tanks kept at home. With that, let's kind of close out by talking about the variations, because there were 11 major marks of this tank with several subvariants and battlefield things. The thing is, Valentine tank was a major part of British tank production, so the fact that it was produced from 1940 through 1944, yeah, there were a lot of changes. So let's end with those. Tank Infantry Mark III was the military name, but there were also variation marks, Vickers, Mark 1, 2, 3. Plus, of course, they would add stars and suffixes, because this is England in the early war. It's confusing. So let's talk about those variants. But first, kind of the fourth possible reason for the name Valentine. Kind of the most simple, but one that historians start to kind of prefer. It was just a name, a project name, a code name given to it at Vickers before it was officially anything. Keep in mind, it didn't have an A designation, so they had to call it something. So this definitely leaves the door open as to why. Kind of just admitting we really don't know. Records don't survive. Anyway, the Valentine Mark I. This was the first version, of course. It had a gasoline or petrol engine. Had a riveted construction. It had a 2-pounder gun and a 2-man turret. And it had a 7.9 millimeter Beza coaxially mounted machine gun. The Mark II was pretty much the same, except it had a diesel engine. And the reason they went to a diesel, well, petrol engines were in short supply in England at the time. They also added this fuel tank on the side here, which was jettisonable. Some would also carry a fuel tank in the rear, depending on the version and time. The Mark III was kind of the first improvement. Remember, the War Office did not like the 2-man turret. So with the Mark III, they introduced a new 3-man turret with a loader plus commander and gunner. Now the turret ring was not changed, so what they had to do was extend the turret out back further and mount the gun further forward. It was even more cramped, and it was also adding quite a bit of weight. To kind of help with this, they did reduce the side armor down to about 50 millimeters. Nevertheless, it was about 500 to 1,000 pounds heavier just because. The Mark IV was actually a Mark II, but built with a GM Detroit engine and transmission, because by this point they were running out of diesel engines in the UK too. And then the Mark V was a Mark III, but with the US engine and transmission. The Brits found the US engine to be reliable, quieter, a little smoother running, but also a little less fuel efficient than the British engine, so a little less range, so you started to see more auxiliary fuel tanks put on here. Now the Mark VI, this was the first Canadian-built Valentine. It was basically a Mark IV. And the Mark VII was an improved Mark VI with an updated radio and some product improvements as they kind of learned how to make it. The Mark IX was kind of the next major change. From the beginning, it wasn't just Russia that wanted a larger gun, but it was really hard to fit the QF 6-pounder into the Valentine. It worked fine in later things like the Churchill, but finally they did it. Now they had to make several sacrifices here, including dropping the loader again, going back to the 2-man turret. It was still a Mark V larger turret, but 2 men to make room for the gun. In fact, they also had to drop the 7.9mm Beza machine gun and all of its ammo. And with the Mark IX, they would go to an uprated engine, at least somewhat, during production. But this would pretty quickly give way to the Mark X, because losing that machine gun was not good. It had no real close defense, so they rearranged the turret yet again, going to a new style that allowed them to add the machine gun back. And then the final major version was the Mark XI, and this had a QF 75, which was a 75mm gun, which was essentially a bored-out QF 6. And these would have improved, uprated engines, pretty much the final things. And these last several versions were more or less all welded. They had gone away from, they kind of had riveting early on, then riveting and welding together, and then finally just all welded. And there would, of course, be differences between Canadian and British production, and even differences between tanks produced in different British factories. There's also the Mark III CS, which was a Mark III that had the QF 3-pounder howitzer installed, originally pulled off Matildas. These were more or less field modifications done by New Zealand for use against the Japanese in the tropical fighting environments. And there's, again, several others. Plus there's the anti-tank or tank destroyer, the Archer, that was based on the chassis, and on and on and on. But, yeah, so production was over before the war, and these did not stay in British service, aside from maybe second-line training type stuff. But they would pop out throughout the late 40s and 50s. For example, they stayed in Australia and New Zealand service into the 1950s. And they would show up here and there, and of course Russia had quite a few, and they'd be used for various purposes throughout the 50s. But it was very much a wartime expedient tank. Not flashy, not revolutionary, but just a good, solid tank. And their idea of trying to combine a cruiser and an infantry tank was not misguided. This might have not been quite the right way. I'd say the major fault there was the low speed. But, you know, got them on the path. So let me know what you think. I'm actually happy to have this, even if it's just a little Eagle Moss tank. I actually had to bring this out of Russia. The tail is pretty neat here too. So I appreciate you tuning in, and next time we'll look at another British heavy. Until then though, this is Misha, and well, I just said it, but yeah, I'll catch you next time.